This video is sponsored by Tormina Chicken Butchery. Well, not really, but I know one of the guys who works there occasionally watches my videos, so I'm hoping to get a free chicken sausage roll out of it. And they are damn good chicken sausage rolls, so if you're in the area, stop by and tell them a doddering old man sent you. Of course, most of my viewers seem to be from the US and the UK, but even so, the sausage rolls are so good they just might be worth travelling halfway around the world for. Maybe, no guarantees. Actually, that chicken shop guy doesn't give a crap about classic JRPGs. I should have saved this for my video on Doom Eternal. Coming soon, maybe. Also no guarantees. And one last thing before I get started, I streamed my playthrough of this game on Twitch, and if for some reason you want to watch a doddering old man blunder his way through a series of random games, there's a link to my Twitch channel below. Would be great to see you stop by for a chat and maybe try to keep me sane as I die for the 50th time to an easy boss. Anyway, after doing a video on Shining Force just a few weeks back, it seems like I'm still in the mood for JRPGs, because today I'm going to be taking a look at Suikoden, the well-loved PS1 game from 1997. Or at least the European and Australian version was released in 97, a year or two after the US and Japanese versions. And 1997 was kind of a big year for JRPGs, as it also saw the release of another game you might have heard of, Final Fantasy VII. In a very real sense, the release of Final Fantasy VII represented the end of an era, but also the dawn of a new one. Particularly in Europe and Australia, which up until then had not yet been blessed with a Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy VII was a true paradigm shift in the world of JRPGs. It certainly changed my understanding of what a JRPG could be. But when I first played Suikoden, FF7 was still months away, and that paradigm shift had not yet occurred. And while Suikoden didn't shift any paradigms or usher in a new era, it took everything good from previous eras of JRPGs and mashed it all together into an amazing shiny new game that was like the apotheosis of all JRPGs. Or at least so it seemed to me at the time. Now, I'm going to take this chance to play through the game again and see if I still think it's the epitome of old school JRPG greatness. But first, a tiny bit of background. I had no idea what the word Suikoden meant when I first played the game. It was only years later that I learned it's the Japanese approximation of the original name of the 14th century Chinese novel known in English as Water Margin. I haven't read that novel and I actually don't know much about it, but it's counted amongst the 4 great classical novels of Chinese literature, along with Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which I have read and which I love. Mainly I love it because I'm a huge fan of the Dynasty Warriors games, but that's a topic for another video. Anyway, Suikoden is loosely based on Water Margin. I don't know enough about the novel to comment on just how loose the adaptation is, but I suspect it's very loose indeed. All I really know is that both the novel and the game are about the 108 Stars of Destiny, a group of bandits and or rebels, depending on your perspective, I guess. So, first things first, naming the main character. Well, it was always Adzor when I was a kid, it was Adzor in Shining Force, so of course in Suikoden it's Vladimir Ulysses Prendergast III. Except that won't fit. Oh well, I guess it's Adzor again. The story starts low-key as most JRPGs do, so you know that of course things are going to change from low-key to high-key rather rapidly. You are the son of Teo McDowell, greatest of the renowned 5 generals. You've lived a life of relative luxury and privilege, but now it's time for you to get off your lazy ass and do some actual work for once. The Emperor sends your father off to quell some rabble-rousers, while you get the cushy task of going to the Imperial Astrologer and retrieving her latest report. And given that this is a fantasy game and not real life, it's safe to assume that the report will contain something more interesting than now is a good time to be more proactive in your career choices, or exciting new relationship opportunities will soon make themselves apparent. This opening section gives you a good look at the best of what the game has to offer in terms of environmental design. It might look kind of crude to modern gamers, it did to me when I first loaded it up after more than 2 decades, but it's classic JRPG stuff and it was a significant step up from the Mega Drive JRPGs I was accustomed to. In retrospect, it's not drastically better than, say, Phantasy Star 4, and in fact I think you could argue that that game is at least Suikoden's equal in terms of visual style. But the higher resolution and greater detail of Suikoden made it seem like a massive leap forward, even if I now find it tough to understand how I could have been so excited by relatively small, sparse and repetitive environments and locations. I was certainly struck in this playthrough by just how little furniture the inhabitants of the Empire seem to have in their rather large houses. Maybe there's been a massive woodworm infestation or something. Oh, and if you notice the aspect ratio looks a little squished, that's due to a glitch in my recording software. That glitch being that I'm an idiot and got the settings wrong. It'll get better in a little while. Anyway, oh yeah, spoiler alert from this point on. You set off with your childhood friends Ted, Pan, Cleo and Gremio, only most of whom will die tragically before the game is over. You meet up with Futch, the Dragon Rider, and his dragon Black, and only one of them will die tragically, which is a step up. Futch antagonises Ted, who inadvertently almost reveals he's 300 years old, something which no one else really seems to notice or care about. You fly to the Astrologer's Island on the back of the dragon, or not, in this epic cutscene it seems like the dragon's flying bareback, and arrive in the game's first combat zone. Now you'll start getting random encounters, the meat of any JRPG. And the combat in Suikoden is really solid, at a fundamental level at least. Obviously at this early stage there's not a lot to it, all you've really got access to is the character's basic melee attacks, but naturally enough as the game goes on you learn a whole host of new spells and abilities. And actually there is one other offensive option you have even in these first battles, and that's the Unite ability. There are certain characters that, when placed next to each other on the field of combat, can execute a combined attack which uses up both characters' turns, but which is typically more powerful or can hit every enemy on the screen. There are also Unite abilities that require 3 particular characters, and even one that requires 4. There's no specific indication in the game as to which characters have these shared attacks, so you need to experiment, but usually they utilise characters that have a relationship or some sort of association in the narrative of the game, and figuring them out was a genuinely satisfying experience when I first played Suikoden. In these first battles it's Pan and Gremio that can unite in an effective but not particularly flashy combo attack. The game also makes one significant concession to user friendliness, and that's the free will option. This just lets all your characters perform their basic attacks on random enemies, making battles against trivial foes a rather, well, trivial experience. Before long you meet the first boss, a rather boring golem who doesn't provide much of a challenge. Turns out it's just a magical creation of Luke, the young apprentice of the astrologer you've come to see, and kind of a dick. He takes you to Lady Lenart? I've never known if the K is supposed to be silent. Anyway, Luke takes you to see her, and she takes Adzor aside to tell him that, surprise surprise, he's destined for great things. Not exactly a groundbreaking plot development, you don't get to be the main character of a JRPG if you're destined to be a turnip farmer. And now tell me in the comments about the hundreds of obscure JRPGs that concern themselves solely with medieval farming practices. Like Harvest Moon, maybe. In this game though, a grander fate awaits our hero. It has to wait a little longer though. With your first task complete, you head home and are immediately sent out again, this time to find out why the peasant scum in the nearby village of Rockland haven't been paying their taxes. It's around this time you might start thinking that maybe this empire you're working for isn't exactly the paragon of benevolence you've been raised to expect. I mean, to us the player it shouldn't come as any real surprise, the word empire is something that's more commonly associated with Death Stars and Stormtroopers, but to Adzor and his chums it's probably a bit of a shock. But the evidence is everywhere. The citizens of Rockland live in poverty and constant fear of mistreatment at the hands of Imperial soldiers, while the mayor lives in luxury. Kanan, the moronic windbag of a bureaucrat you've brought with you, clearly doesn't give a toss about the people, but only wants to ensure that the taxes keep flowing at an optimal rate. To that end, Adzor and his band of merry men, plus one woman, are tasked with solving the local bandit problem, as they're apparently the reason the taxes have gone astray. And incidentally, the Robin Hood reference is kind of appropriate, because as far as I can tell there are some parallels between that old English legend and Suikoden, at least in as much as both are stories of apparently virtuous bandits who steal from the rich to help the poor. At this point in the story, Adzor and friends are still working for the Empire, but that's not going to last much longer. On their way to deal with the bandits, they encounter a giant ant queen demon monster thing, which they just cannot defeat. Ted steps up and obliterates it with some form of dark magic. And that's undoubtedly helpful, but dark magic often carries with it dark consequences, which is a melodramatic way of saying bad shit's about to go down. With the bandits successfully dispatched, the party returns home, but Kanan asks Ted to go with him, and that's the last we see of Ted, for about 5 minutes. He shows up that evening at Adzor's house, weak and on the verge of death. He tells Adzor that Windy, the court magician, tried to take the cursed Soul Eater rune from him, but he used it to escape at great cost to himself. With his not quite dying breath, he begs Adzor to take the Soul Eater rune and keep it safe. Which of course Adzor does. He's not the protagonist of a JRPG for nothing. Imperial soldiers, guided by that obstinate bastard Pan, arrive to recapture Ted. Adzor's having none of that, of course, but Ted decides to act as a distraction while Adzor and his remaining pals escape, which they do, aided by a mysterious stranger known as Victor. So, now Adzor and his crew are fugitives, hunted by the Imperial army, and especially by Windy, who really wants that Soul Eater rune, and probably not because it's good for making the fluffiest shortcakes you ever did see. And that's basically the first chapter of the game, and the setup for everything that comes after. As far as premises for JRPGs go, it was quite impressive for the time. These days it seems perhaps a little simplistic, but it still does a good job of setting up a relatively complex world of political intrigue and martial conflict. And there is some moral ambiguity here. The characters aren't sure they're doing the right thing in going against the Empire, which they've always believed to be a strong and virtuous force in the world. Again, it's nothing that can really compete with the incredibly complex and nuanced stories of the best of today's RPGs, but hey, not everything needs to be burdened with complexity and nuance. And back in those days, when for me Final Fantasy was still just a whisper of a rumour of something I might have read about once or twice in a games magazine, Suikoden's story really was up there with the best of them. Anyway, it turns out that Victor is one of those damn dirty rebel scum, or Liberation Army as they prefer to be called. He takes Adzor to meet Odessa, current leader of the Liberation Army, and yeah, you probably don't need to bother learning her name, she ain't gonna be around for long. She sends you off to rescue Varkas and Sidonia, the two bandits you captured earlier. They've been tied to posts and just left to starve to death, and this callous act on behalf of the Empire is basically the final straw that leads Adzor and his cadre to fully embrace the rebel lifestyle. Bad boys for life, and some girls too. Varkas and Sidonia join up, and so your numbers begin to swell. Odessa's next task involves transporting blueprints for a secret weapon to the Rebellion's hidden factory. The highlights of this trip include the party falling for the world's most obvious poison tea trap, plus a heart-to-heart conversation between Adzor and Odessa. And if you know much about JRPG conventions, you can probably guess that Odessa's lifespan can now be measured in minutes. And so it goes. Imperial soldiers find the rebel hideout and Odessa heroically dies, saving a small child. Tragic. It might seem I'm skipping lightly over some pretty significant story moments, and I guess I am, but the fact is Suikoden doesn't waste much time with words either. Everything happens quickly and with a minimum of fuss. To modern gamers, the narratives of older JRPGs can seem way too shallow, and I was struck by that feeling here, as well as when I played Shining Force a little while back. But when I first played those games, I considered them to be epic stories of great depth and breadth. What's changed? Is it me, or is it games in general? Well, I'm pretty happy to conclude that it's both. Games have definitely changed. Like I said before, they're much more complex now, but I've changed too. It's a cliche, but to some extent my capacity for imagination has dimmed over the years. 25 years ago, my own overactive mind would have filled in all the details. I would have made Odessa's death into something richly tragic. Now though, I find it almost comically abrupt. But again, I want to stress that this is not necessarily a bad thing. God knows there are plenty of JRPGs that are way too long-winded. And Suikoden is, after all, a game based on ancient legends, and the characters are archetypes of Chinese literature. They don't need to be fully fleshed out, and the game presents them with a clarity and simplicity of purpose that is genuinely appealing. And actually, one of the most appealing elements of all is about to make its appearance. With her dying breath, Odessa tells Adzor to seek out Matao, Odessa's brother and one-time strategist for the Imperial Army. He's living now as a simple schoolteacher and is reluctant to take up arms again, but on hearing of his sister's death he realises that maybe this time armed conflict is justified if it can bring about a better world. It's decided that the rebels, with Adzor leading now that Odessa has met her fate, need a bigger and better base of operations, and by a happy coincidence there's an abandoned castle not too far away. Once the zombie dragon in the basement has been convinced to seek housing elsewhere, or just, slaughtered, the rebel army moves in. You now have a home base, and it really is a home. Every single character you recruit, and remember there are 108 of them throughout the game, will move into the castle and can be found wandering around and going about their business. I mean, their business mostly consists of the standard JRPG NPC pastime of randomly walking backwards and forwards, but at least you can stop and chat with them. Quite a few of the characters you can recruit turn out to be non-combatants who instead fulfill a particular role within the castle. For instance, you can recruit Marie, the woman who ran the inn back in your hometown, and she'll open her own establishment in your castle, letting you rest and save your game. You can also recruit people who will open an item shop and an armor shop, and someone who will let you equip and unequip the runes that let you cast magic spells. Basically, you're creating your own little JRPG town, complete with all the amenities you'd expect. Except it actually becomes quite large. Certainly it ends up a lot bigger than any actual town in the game. And it's not just shopkeepers that can be recruited. You can find someone who will let you switch between different sound effects, someone who can change the colours of the game's menus and user interface, and someone who lets you listen to all the different music in the game. It really is a very cool idea. In practice, it's kind of a pain to have to walk all the way to a distant corner of your castle to talk to a specific character just to change the background of the game's UI, but it's just so charming that I think it's worth it. Anyway, with a base of operations firmly established, the rebel army sets about gathering more recruits and taking down some of the Imperial Army's fortifications. I'm going to skip over quite a lot of this. Most of it consists of fairly standard JRPG tropes, and if I started going in depth on everything that happens, you'd probably just be better off playing the game yourself. Which I recommend, actually, if you have that option. You start off by recruiting Lepant, the orangest man in the universe, as well as his devoted wife. After that, an elf randomly shows up in your castle, begging you to help save his village, which leads to a whole side quest with elves, dwarves, and kobolds. Oh, and the elf village gets destroyed anyway. Well done, Adzor. Turns out the Imperial General Quanda Rosman has a secret weapon that can burn down entire forests, and he needs to be stopped. To this end, Adzor and the rebel army attack his stronghold. And here we come to another element that sets Suikoden apart from other JRPGs of its time. There are several large battles like this throughout the game. In gameplay terms they're quite simple. You select between a charge, bow or magic attack, or one of several other non-offensive options, like using a spy to see what the enemy is going to do, or using a strategist to boost your charge attack power. The combat is basically a rock-paper-scissors contest, with charge beating a bow attack defeating a magic attack from a safe distance, and a magic attack blasting an incoming charge attack. That's pretty simple stuff, but the best things about these strategic battles is they give you a good reason to want to actively go out and seek new recruits. You see, not only does your army get larger the more recruits you have, you also get more offensive and defensive options, and some characters that you never have a use for in the rest of the game can be very useful in these battles. For instance, I never had Lepant in my main party, but in these early battles he and his wife form a group that has the highest charge attack power. And later in the game you can recruit a hidden ninja if you can find him. I never use this ninja in the rest of the game, but in these battles ninjas have a 100% success rate when spying on the enemy, which makes them incredibly useful, so I felt like I'd achieved something simply by tracking him down. Oh, and there's one more thing about these battles. If you screw up and use an ineffective attack, for instance your magic attack gets demolished by the enemy's archers, as happened here to me in the next battle, the character that led the attack can die, permanently, which is what happened to Luke. So he's genuinely gone for good. And not only that, there's a secret event near the end of the game that will only occur if you've recruited all 108 characters and they're all alive. So that won't be happening. And it gets even worse. In another extremely cool little twist, the sequel, Suikoden 2, lets you transfer your save data from this game. And if you got all 108 characters in this game and got the secret event, you get a nifty little bonus in the sequel. So, simply by dying now, Luke has destroyed any chance of getting 100% in not only this game, but its sequel as well. God damn it, Luke. If you weren't already dead, I'd kill you myself. I told you he was a dick. Anyway, you get the option to either kill the defeated General Rosman or recruit him to your party. If you want to get all 108 Stars of Destiny on your side, you obviously need to recruit him. That doesn't really matter in my case, of course. Luke's already messed things up for me, damn it. But you also learn that Rosman has been mind-controlled by court magician Windy, and that now that he's no longer under her control, he's back to his normal, non-evil villain self, which is basically a good thing. And so the game progresses. You try to attack the similarly mind-controlled General Milch's fortress, but the strange flowers there repel you. I know how that goes. I've got pretty bad hay fever at the moment myself. In order to get past them, you need to track down the wise old Liu Kang, as distinct from Liu Kang from Mortal Kombat. As far as I know, this old guy doesn't turn into a dragon and bite people in half. This takes me far longer than it should, because in order to progress you have to specifically take your boat to the whirlpool that blocks passage to his hut, then return to the town you departed from. And I never did that, because I knew that the boat couldn't get past the whirlpool, so why bother? Turns out you have to bother, I guess. Anyway, when you finally make it to Liu Kang, he gets captured by the Imperial Army anyway. Typical. You rescue him, he kills the flowers for you, or just gives you a powerful antihistamine or something, and you take over General Milch's fortress. Hurrah! And oh yeah, Gremio sacrifices himself to save Adzor. Tragic, I say again. He gets consumed by man-eating spores apparently, which is probably not a great way to go. Oh well, he will be missed. Next up, there's a showdown with your father, the great General Teo McDowell. The battle itself is easy enough, by which I mean it's literally impossible to win, so you might as well take it easy. In the aftermath, Pan confronts Teo while everyone else escapes, and a duel ensues. There are a few duels like this throughout the game. They're kind of like a one-on-one version of the large battles, and that you each have 3 choices of attack that kind of work like rock, paper, scissors. Apparently it's possible to win this duel, but I very definitely do not manage that. Pan gets demolished and is in fact now perma-dead. So I guess I can't solely blame Luke for ruining 2 games for me. Well, that's another main character dead. Adzor doesn't seem too distraught though, or to have any emotions at all now I think about it. Guess that's why he makes such a good leader. In fact, he takes some time out to play one of Suikoden's several mini-games. There are a few little diversions like this. They're all pretty mindless and serve no real purpose, other than recruiting the person running the game, and maybe making some bonus cash if you're good at them. But hey, they're a nifty little addition. Anyway, in between card and dice games, Adzor manages to acquire some fire spears that will allow the rebel army to stand a chance against Teo's cavalry. So the next battle goes a lot better for them. Now it's Adzor's turn to duel against his father. Losing this time is a game over, so I guess I better win, which I do, after dying a few times. No big deal. So Teo dies at his own son's hand and also in his arms. It's actually quite a dramatic moment, highlighting the ultimate futility of war, or something. The next section of the game involves a somewhat unexpected sojourn into a vampire's castle. It seems like a bit of a random turn for the story to take, but it does reveal a bit of Victor's backstory. Apparently he's got history with this vampire, the amusingly named Necklord, who presumably ranks just above Shoulder Lord and just below Head Lord. In order to kill this Necklord, you need to find the sentient talking star dragon sword, who sends you back in time 300 years for some reason. Yeah, things get a bit outlandish at this point. But wait, 300 years? You may exclaim if you remember the start of this video, and God knows I don't. Isn't that how old Ted claimed to be? Yes, as you might be able to guess, we're about to meet young Ted and witness how he came to possess the Soul Eater rune after his village was destroyed by the villainous Windy. You remember her too, right? The court magician from the start of the game? No? Oh well, I can't blame you. Long story short, Victor's got the Star Dragon sword, Ted's got the Soul Eater rune, but he's going to have to wait 300 years before he can do anything about it. So now Adzor and his posse are able to dispatch Necklord and, I forget why we were doing that actually. Just to help out the warrior village and persuade them to help us, I guess. And then it's time to get the Dragon Clan on our side, in another side quest. Honestly, Suikoden isn't massive as far as JRPGs go, even for the time. It only took me a little over 16 hours to get through, but it's quite fast paced and a lot happens within those 16 hours. This Dragon Clan episode is the last major diversion before the final battle, and it's quite a substantial one. The dragons have been poisoned, so you need to gather ingredients for an antidote. This involves a lengthy dungeon crawl for the first of them, but the second ingredient is an orchid that only grows in the Emperor's private garden. Futch, another character from the start of the game you may or may not remember, sets off with his trusty dragon Black to find it. He encounters the Emperor himself, who seems surprisingly benevolent and willing to let him take the flower and go. Windy shows up though and knocks him out of the sky with a blast of lightning. Futch survives and wakes up back in the Dragon Fortress to find that the sleeping dragons have been cured. But then comes the tragic twist. The third ingredient in the cure was a dragon's liver, which was supplied by Black, who died protecting his friend. And this is about the closest the game came to drawing out any emotion from me, which wasn't very close to be honest. I'm a sucker for tragic tales, but the storytelling here is still too primitive and abrupt to really have an effect. And again, I'm not complaining, not every game has to be a staggering work of heartbreaking genius. Suikoden is a product of its time, and that's fine. And now the end nears. With the assistance of the Dragon Knights, the rebel army is able to take out the northern stronghold, which basically leaves the imperial city of Gregminster, the place the story started, isolated and vulnerable. The city is a very different place now, and I genuinely love the way the music from the start of the game is still playing, but very faintly and accompanied by a desolate wind. All that remains is to make our way through the final dungeon. But unfortunately, this is kind of a low point for the game. It's not an interesting dungeon, the enemies are standard Imperial soldiers, and the tedium is exacerbated by the fact that there's a lengthy series of forced battles against identical foes. It gets frustrating, and it's just not good game design. The last boss is, well, it's not great, but it's not bad. And I might take this chance to talk about the downsides of the combat in Suikoden. I described it earlier as solid, and it is. Relative to other similar games of the time, you have a decent array of spells and abilities to choose from, enhanced by the fact that there are just so many different characters you can have in your party, and by these special unite attacks that are fun to discover. The problem is that the game never really presents you with opportunities to fully explore the possibilities that the combat system offers. Regular enemies don't take any real thought or effort to defeat, and bosses are relatively few and far between. And even when they do show up, they're not much of a challenge. The only time I ever died in combat was on a couple of occasions when I found myself in a boss fight before I had a chance to heal up my party. With a full-strength team, pretty much every enemy was kind of a joke. And that also applies to the final boss, I'm afraid. It's a visually impressive three-headed golden hydra, but so long as you're suitably leveled and have plenty of healing items, it doesn't pose much of a threat. Even my own significant stupidity couldn't make the fight a challenge. You see, the head on the left heals the other heads, but I failed to realise this and killed the one on the right first, which was then immediately resurrected by the one on the left. A pro move by the dragon, a noob move by me. But I still prevailed. And that's it. That's the end of the game. The Emperor is defeated. Windy nevertheless tries to take Adzor's Soul Eater rune, but it turns out the rune must have indigestion, because the souls it has eaten return and blast Windy with dark magic. Windy feels understandably rejected. She's been so dang evil, but the cursed Soul Eater rune still doesn't want her. But then the Emperor reveals that in fact he's never been under her mind control. He's acted as he has simply because he loves her. And then he throws her off the roof garden. And himself as well. And actually this is a pretty good moment. There really is some genuine pathos here, helped by the mournful music. It would have been nice if there was some more sophisticated plot and character development leading up to this, but it's nevertheless quite an emotional ending by the standards of the day at least. Anyway, the castle starts collapsing, because that's what castles in JRPGs do once the last boss has been defeated. Adzor and crew beat a hasty retreat, but Victor and Flick stay behind to ensure their escape, and are presumably lost in the rubble. Or are they? Find out next time when I play through Suikoden 2. Well, it won't be next time. It might not even happen this year, or next, but it will happen, unless something unforeseen happens. Which, given the way this year's going so far, is actually pretty foreseeable. Finally, before the credits roll, you get a run-through of all 108 stars of destiny and a one-sentence description of what they did next. Any stars you didn't manage to recruit remain blank, and I consider this to be an excellent touch, as it really gives you some motivation to run through the game again and be a little more thorough this time. And that's Suikoden. You might have noticed that I found it tough in this retrospective to get the right balance between considering it as a game of its era and comparing it to modern games. As a game of its era, it was undeniably excellent, but it has aged less well than other similarly ancient games. Actually, it might be more accurate to say that it's not Suikoden that's aged poorly, but rather the entire JRPG genre. But no, I don't think that's accurate either. There are plenty of JRPGs from the time that are still great, it's just that the genre has evolved greatly. Ultimately, I suspect it's not helpful to consider games like Suikoden better or worse than their modern counterparts. They just come from a simpler time and need to be looked at accordingly. I'm sorry if that sounds wishy-washy, but I guess I'm a wishy-washy sort of guy. For me though, in a way Suikoden stands as the last of the great old-school JRPGs. I know that's not remotely accurate. For one thing, Suikoden 2 is counted by many as better than the first, and it came out after Final Fantasy VII. But Suikoden was the last JRPG I played before FF7 completely redefined my understanding of what a JRPG could be. So, trying to be as objective as possible, I'd say that Suikoden is a fundamentally very solid JRPG with a narrative that, while it's quite simple in its telling, nevertheless has a compelling basis in an intriguing world of politics and magic. The combat is good, but really could have benefited with some more interesting foes to test your might. The graphics are definitely old school even for their time, and certainly didn't push the PlayStation to its limits, but that classic JRPG look is still highly appealing. And the music. Once again, I've left the music right until near the end, but it's actually really good. It doesn't quite reach the excellence of a Final Fantasy soundtrack, but there are some great and truly evocative melodies, and the orchestration is superb. It occurs to me that Suikoden may be a game that's ripe for a remake, or at least a reboot. All the elements are there for a truly excellent JRPG, they just need a bit of zhuzhing up for the modern audience. Well, that's it for now. I really do intend to play Suikoden at some point in the not too distant future. It's been sitting on my shelf for decades, but I've never got around to playing it. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please consider subscribing or hitting the like button or even following me on Twitch. And until next time, get off my lawn.